Who is the most clutch player in the Premier League? If we're talking all time, it could be this guy. Or maybe him. Some people would argue could be him. But what if we wanted to answer that question for this season using this season's data? Welcome back to SincereFC. This episode is about leverage and performance when it matters most. The first question is, how do you define being clutch in football? Some people say it's your ability to score in finals. But what about all the players who don't play in the finals? Not to mention, leagues don't have finals. Others might say it's your ability to score against the best teams in the league. But what if you play for one of the worst teams in the league? Your most important games, the ones you can win, are actually against the other teams around you. So for every player, on every club, in every season, it looks a bit different. So I created a metric that we can calculate for any player, in any season, on any team. Let's begin. Two sports have popularized metrics that define performance in the clutch: basketball and baseball. In basketball, the definition is very simple. If there are fewer than 5 minutes remaining in the game, and the margin of score is 5 points or fewer, all players' statistics are being counted in the clutch category. This scenario is relatively common. Many NBA games end with a margin of victory of 5 or fewer points. In baseball, the statistic measures what's called the leverage of any individual contest between a batter and a pitcher. The leverage describes how much the win probability for each team can change depending on what happens in this plate appearance. If there are runners on the bases and the margin of score is very small, one team can go from losing to winning in an instant. The closer to the end of the game this is, the more of an impact it has on each team's win probability. So you can evaluate a player's performance in the high leverage moments and the low leverage moments. Now let's talk about football. And before we go any further, let's be clear. This video is about scoring goals. The best way to measure the performance of players who tackle, save shots, and make key passes is a separate question. It's also harder to find the data on something like that. But what is available is a match report showing every shot at every minute by every player in every match. Using this information, I took every shot from every player and categorized them in two ways. First, how good is the team they're playing? If you've played Fantasy Premier League, you'll be familiar with this idea. FPL rates every player's upcoming fixtures on a difficulty scale from 1 to 5. Although they don't publish how they make this metric, we can use available information to come up with something similar. Each time your football team plays a new opponent, you know these 4 things about that opponent: their recent win rate, I chose to look at the last 7 games, their goal difference across those 7 games, the total amount of points gained in the league this season so far, and finally, their ELO score. This is useful at the beginning of the season when we don't have recent games from the opponent to look at. We can then use these 4 numbers to produce a difficulty score. Just like in Fantasy Premier, 1 represents the easiest game, and I chose to use 7 instead of 5 to represent the hardest game. Most times teams faced Southampton this season, the difficulty was 1 or 2. When they faced Liverpool, the difficulty was usually 6 or 7. Next, we measure the importance of every moment within each game. This starts with a data set showing how likely a team is to win given the score of the game and the minute, as well as how likely you are to draw or to lose. Given that a win is worth 3 points and a draw is worth 1, you can use these percentages to figure out a team's expected points given the score and the minute. If you're ahead 3-0 in the 90th minute, your expected points is basically 3. If you're ahead 1-0 in the 30th minute, your expected points is much closer to 1. To measure the importance of a moment in a football match, I chose to use the difference in expected points that comes from scoring at that moment. If you're up 3-0 with 8 minutes to go and you score to make it 4-0, you barely changed your team's expected points. Whereas if the game is tied with 8 minutes to go, if you score, you go from near 1 expected points to well above 2. So that's it. The more you change your team's chances of winning by scoring in a certain moment, the more important that goal was. Here are some examples of the most important goals this year. For each of them, the game was nearly over and the score was tied. Here's how this data looks for some of the top Premier League goal scorers this season through match day 30. Here's how it looks if we add the information about game difficulty. I divided games into 3 buckets: scores between 1 and 2, scores from 3 to 5, and scores from 6 to 7. How does it change our perspective? Jean-Philippe Mateta finished with the most goals in difficult games with 7. Among the top 3 goal scorers, Alexander Isak had the most with 6. Palmer and Strand Larsen each scored 1. Let's compare them. Although Strand Larsen only scored 1 goal in a hard match, playing for Wolves means that the more important games are the easier and medium ones, as those are the games where Wolves can actually win points. Now, we look at the top goal scorers through the lens of the importance of each goal. Despite his reputation for going missing in finals, Mohamed Salah scored as many high-leverage goals as any other player through matchday 30. He was tied with Mateta, who naturally has more opportunities to score these goals, playing for a team that spends less time winning. Again, the results don't look great for Cole Palmer, who didn't score any high-leverage goals this season. His most important, by my metric, gave Chelsea the lead in the 47th minute in their first match against Newcastle. So that was the top goal scorers. But what if we look at everyone in the Premier League at once? This time, instead of using counting stats, we're going to put everyone on a scattergram. I think we need the Donkey Kong music back. What you can see now is a scattergram with every Premier League player who scored at least 5 goals. For each player, I took the average of the difficulty scores and the importance scores of all their goals. There's some average number for each of these, which I've indicated with the red and green dotted lines. Every player's position on the scattergram is their score normalized in relation to the average. How should you read this? If you're on the top part of the scattergram, the goals you scored in came against better teams in the division. Justin Kluivert is at the top. Of his 6 non-penalty goals through matchday 30, 4 came against teams in the top 4. Newcastle and Nottingham Forest were both on 7-match unbeaten runs prior to their games against Bournemouth. Kevin Schade is the lowest player. Of his 7 non-penalty goals, 6 came against teams in the bottom 3, and 3 came in one game against Leicester City. If you're on the right part of the scattergram, the goals you scored influence the games you scored in a lot. Rodrigo Muniz is the player most to the right. 5 of his 7 goals gave his team the lead, and 4 of them came in the 75th minute or later. Dejan Kulusevski is the furthest to the left. 4 of his 7 goals came in matches that were basically already over, either with Tottenham having won or lost the match. Only one of those goals came when his team was either tied or down by a goal. There are some patterns visible here under the surface that we need to understand. You can see how everyone who scored a lot is close to the middle. If you score a lot, you're bound to score against good and bad teams, and in all moments of the game, whether they're important or not. If you score fewer times, it's natural that your score can end up being more extreme. So what if we show players who only scored at least 10 times? What can we see? The players on the left didn't just fail to score important goals. Their teams spent more time winning matches. The players on the right scored goals that won their team's points, because most of them aren't on very good teams. Now let's dive deeper. According to my metric, Ollie Watkins' goals skewed as the most important among players who scored at least 10. All but one of his 11 goals either tied the game or gave Aston Villa the lead. On the other hand, Palmer and Haaland's goals skewed as the least important. This aligns with some media narratives about these 2 players this season, that neither had a particularly good year. Now we're going to split the diagram according to the team's quality, showing Matheus Cunha, who finished in 17th place, and Salah, whose team finished first, doesn't really seem fair. Here are all the players whose teams won at least 50% of their games this year. One reason I'm starting to like this stat is because of how well it connects to the eye test. We can connect the locations of these players to their team's performance this year. Liverpool won the league. They have 3 players on the right, as well as one of the volume goal scorers this year. Arsenal have 4 players on the right, but their star players, Saka and Havertz, didn't score that many clutch goals. Manchester City, who finished the strongest of any team after this data was collected, had nobody scoring important goals this year when Erling Haaland wasn't scoring. Like Arsenal, their defenders' goals skewed as the most important. Chelsea's most clutch player was their midfield captain, Enzo Fernandez, but their entire team finished in the bottom part of this diagram. They simply couldn't do it against good opposition. Newcastle rode Alexander Isak to a 5th-placed finish, with help from Gordon, Jacob Murphy, and Harvey Barnes. If the Magpies want to improve on this finish, somebody from this group or a new signing is going to have to step up. Nottingham Forest had 4 players who did all the scoring for them this year. The fact that all of them are near to or in the top right quadrant suggests that they did about as well as they could. Aston Villa benefited from the early season form of John Duran, who scored several important goals, as well as Ollie Watkins, who was clutch throughout the season. And finally, this chart doesn't bode so well for England's national team. The players furthest to the right are Watkins and Hudson-Odoi. Most of England's typical star players are off to the left. Now, let's look at the rest of the teams. These are the teams who won less than 50% of their matches. I won't go through every team, but here are some brief observations. Leave a comment below if you're a fan of one of these clubs and this data agrees with your eye test. The most outlandish team is Fulham. They have 3 of the players furthest to the top right in the diagram. This suggests some overperformance, so it will be interesting to see where they finish next season. Bryan Mbeumo and Yohan Wissa may have scored more goals than any previous duo of bottom-half strikers, but their position on this chart helps you understand why Brentford didn't finish very high despite those numbers. The goals weren't always very important. West Ham and Manchester United fans won't be surprised to see their lack of players on this diagram, but they can be under no delusions as to who their most important attacking players are. The most clutch goal scorer for Tottenham was actually Brennan Johnson, but the rest of their attackers will want to put this season behind them. Wolves' best player was clearly Matheus Cunha, but Jorgen Strand Larsen had a good season full of important goals for a club that will have their hands full after selling Cunha. Sorry to Brighton, Bournemouth, Crystal Palace, and Everton fans. I couldn't think of anything to say about your team from this diagram. Southampton and Leicester, however, you guys need to work on getting someone on the diagram. Now, what can we say about next season? Do I know if this data will predict the future? No, and I don't believe it should. But it's remarkable that for the England team in the 2024 Euros, arguably the most important goal of their tournament was scored by Ollie Watkins. And for Tottenham in this season's Europa League, their cup-winning goal was scored by Brennan Johnson. For the past several minutes, we've been hanging out in scattergram land. Let's return to the counting stats that we know and love. Instead of showing how each player's goals are skewing from important to not and high to low difficulty, let's just count everyone's goals per game. In this diagram, for all players with 5 goals or more, we can see their goals per game in low and medium difficulty matches and goals per game in high difficulty matches. The goal is simply to be in the top right. Nobody had a better goal-to-game ratio across all of their matches than Alexander Isak this season. This chart also shows how players like Rodrigo Muniz end up all the way to the right in the scattergram. It's not just that Muniz scored against all the good teams. He never scored against anybody else. This suggests something about Muniz that isn't necessarily good. When Fulham were playing teams better than them, that wanted to keep possession and allowed Fulham to counter, he had success. But when Fulham played teams worse than them, teams that let Fulham keep the ball, he didn't have success. This is why having stats that connect with the eye test is so important. If you're a scout trying to sign a striker, this is something you need to know. Next, we go back to just counting. On one axis, we can see players' goals in low and medium leverage, and then their goals in high leverage. High leverage goals are not that common. Many of the best players in the division only scored 1 or 2. So the fact that Mo Salah ended up with 4 high leverage goals and finished in the top 3 of the non-high leverage goals leaves me with little doubt as to the fact that this was one of the great attacking seasons from a Premier League player. Now, so far, we've only looked at one side of the data. Sure, it's helpful to look at the goals being scored, but even good players only convert 30 or 40% of their opportunities. What if, instead of when you score, we measure the importance when you miss? Because many shots in football are unlikely to go in, I only defined a miss as a shot that didn't end up in a goal that had an XG of .28. If you watched these opportunities, I think you would agree that these are ones the best players should be putting into the net a lot of the time. First, we'll look at the difficulty. What do we see? Although Ollie Watkins scored 10 important goals for Aston Villa, he also missed 13 big chances. You can see most of the league's strikers at or above 6 in terms of the number of big chances missed. This data doesn't look great for Nicholas Jackson, who, of players who missed at least 9 big chances, had the highest weighted difficulty score, which means he was missing these chances in some big games. Erling Haaland's missed chances skewed towards bigger games than Mohamed Salah and Alexander Isak. Now, let's look at the misses and the in-game importance of each one. Mohamed Salah's misses came in less important moments than Erling Haaland and Alexander Isak. Among players who had at least 6 missed chances, Yoane Wissa's skewed as being the most important on average within the game. And we have our first outlier in Everton striker Beto. He missed 6 big chances this season, and all of them were extremely important to the match outcome. Once you understand the context of a player's successes and their failures, you can begin to assess how clutch they really are. Which players are much better at shooting when the stakes are low? And if pressure gets to them, which kind of pressure is it? Is it the pressure of the occasion? Big match on Super Sunday on national television, where you know you're going against the best? Or is it the pressure of the moment, where the next action, the next 5 seconds, will determine the outcome of the game and the mood in the training ground for the next week? For someone like Ollie Watkins, it seems the pressure of the moment isn't necessarily an issue in games where Aston Villa have a good chance to win. However, perhaps the pressure of the opposition is more of a factor. Now that we've looked at goals, misses, and the impact of each, what if we want to understand how they compare? In this video, I've shown how every player accumulates some number of points for the goals they score, and also accumulates those points for all the big chances they miss. Let's look at Alexander Isak. In the first 30 games of this season, he scored 18 non-penalty goals. From those goals, he racked up a total difficulty score of 8.93. Remember, although the difficulty scores are from 1 to 7, once you normalize it, it becomes a score between 0 and 1, where 0 represents the worst team you've ever seen, and .99 represents 2009 FC Barcelona. As for the total importance score, the expected points added, he ended with a score of 9.94. On the flip side, Isak missed 9 big chances. From those chances, the total difficulty score was 2.44, and the total importance score was 4.14. Thus, Isak ended with a difference of 6.49 in difficulty and about 5.8 in terms of importance. Here's how that compares to everybody else in the Premier League. There's too many players here. The first thing to do is divide it into smaller groups. One way to divide it is by the difference between your goals and your missed chances. I split the data into 3 groups. Players who had scored at most 3 more goals than chances they missed, players who had between 4 and 7, and everybody else with more than that. We've effectively created 3 tiers of forwards here. How clutch each of those forwards are within their tier is what you see in the diagram. How does this relate to the original scattergram? We said Ollie Watkins' goals skewed as the most important this season, but he also led the league in big chances missed. The net importance of those goals was around average for forwards this season. The difficulty was not. He scored against the poor teams and missed big chances against the good ones. For Muniz, the top right player in the scattergram, he's also the furthest to the top right amongst people in the red. Although his ratio of goals to misses is similar to those players, when he scored, it mattered a lot. As we saw in some of the other diagrams, Beto and Nicholas Jackson had some of the more costly misses this year. Naturally, they end up in the bottom left of this diagram. And although these thresholds are arbitrary, the fact that Erling Haaland ended up amongst the yellow suggests that this year's performance fell short by his standards. So that split was about player performance. But another way to split the data is to divide players by how good their teams are. Now, you can see one diagram with the players on teams who won at least half of their matches, and the other diagram with all the other teams. And once you split it by team, One player in this year's Premier League starts to stand out. Not only did everyone on the top right have a good season, they pretty much all play on the good teams. But then there's Matheus Cunha. Cunha, whose team finished in 17th, scored 14 goals up to this point and had missed only one big chance. That's a difference of 13. No other player had a difference of larger than 9, and among the other players on bad teams, nobody's difference score comes even close. We've taken a journey through this year's Premier League, but how do the top goal scorers from the other top 5 leagues compare? Just like we showed the Premier League's forwards in 3 tiers, here's that same split for the top 5 leagues. Erling Haaland and Kylian Mbappe ended up as the best forwards in Tier 2. Here are all the forwards in Tier 1. To be green is to be clinical. The further you are to the right, the more that mattered to your results. The further you are up, the better your opponents were. The only player on this diagram to have played for 2 different teams is Omar Marmoush. I've combined his stats here. If you look at his performance across the whole of last season, he looks like one of the most clinical players in Europe. Here are the players on the elite European teams. Among these teams, Nicholas Jackson was the least clinical forward. Ousmane Dembele and Marmoush may have been the most. Here are the rest of the teams. Matheus Cunha really stands out when you see it from this perspective. Here's the same scattergram from before, with all the elite players in Europe, for every player with at least 10 goals. You may notice the players from the Premier League moved a little bit. This is because we recalculated the average using all the top 5 leagues together. Notice anything? As I said before, I like that this data agrees with what I feel like I've seen. Julian Alvarez is the player furthest to the top right. I believe fans would agree that he's both a big match player and the player you want a chance to fall to in the biggest moment. Rafinha's location surprised me, as I'm not a Barcelona fan. Once I looked into his stats, I see that although he didn't score many high-leverage goals in La Liga, he scored crucial goals in Barcelona's knockout competition matches and scored against Barcelona's big La Liga rivals. He's the furthest to the left. The only player further to the right than Ollie Watkins is Ayoze Perez. Of his 12 non-penalty goals, 11 were very important to the match outcome. Premier League fans may remember him from his days at Newcastle and Leicester. Now at Villarreal, he's become a bit of a bagsman. Now, who had the emptiest stats? Across Europe, whose goals skewed as the least important against the worst teams in their division? What do you think? Oops. Wait, the video can't end like that. That's such a negative note. Is this even a valid measure? And I never answered the original question. So let me give my answer. But before I do, if you're talking about being clutch in football, you have to know what you mean. Because being clutch within the league season works differently from being clutch in a knockout competition. I could have shown the schedule from the previous Premier League season and marked the weekends when all the different players scored. Obviously Salah, Isak, and Erling Haaland would be all over that. In the league season, being clutch is scoring over and over again. The players in the center with the massive dots have achieved the goal set out for them. I shouldn't really be criticizing the people skewed to the left. They've already done their share. But there's another side of the game being examined here. For every player who doesn't score enough to get pulled into that middle area, you get an idea of what the conditions are like when they're scoring. Are you looking at a player who chances fall to in the key moments? Is this a player who, on a mediocre team, has the ability to kill giants? Or is it a player who thrives against some of the worst competition? A player whose level rises in situations where the game is just not as intense as the games at the highest level. In a knockout competition, a measure like this doesn't make as much sense to me. Trying to measure whether players score goals in high or low leverage moments feels dismissive of the moment itself. It's all high leverage, and every goal is massively important to both teams in the match. But for the vast majority of top-level teams, the league is where you make your money. Scouts are looking for players who can perform in the most important moments of the league, and this is the quickest way to find them. Now back to the original question. The easy answer is Mo Salah. He was the best player on the best team, but he didn't do it alone. Other players helped Liverpool secure key points along the way. So when you ask me who the most clutch player was, I'm not going to pick a star. I chose to pick someone who, when the game was on the line, could be counted on to do the business. For this season, I'd have to agree with Fulham's social media manager. If you enjoyed the video, leave a like and subscribe. Leave a comment below for what other aspects of the game you want to see covered, and I hope to see you again on Sincere FC very soon.